We believe that most companies are losing somewhere between 20 and 30% of their net profits simply because of the fact that they're not treating everybody the same. I wrote an article in April of 2018 in Forbes in which I said the title was,
Today's guest is Paolo Gaudiano, a neuroscientist, aerospace engineer, entrepreneur, and the mind behind Aleria and ARC. He helps companies improve performance through data-driven inclusion strategies. As founder of Aleria and ARC, a TED speaker, and author of Measuring Inclusion, Paolo's mission is clear: prove that inclusive companies aren't just fairer, they're more profitable.
What is kind of your vision, like the future of the workplace and kind of DEI as a whole as we look forward?
my hope is that people will start to take more seriously the notion that they need to think of their human assets. We think as human beings that we can tell what works and what doesn't work. And unfortunately, there are a couple of mistakes that people very often make when they're making decisions about who to hire. First one is that,
How would you define what built for this means to you?
to me, there was something that resonated with me. It took me 53 years of my life to figure out what I want to do when I grow up. So I would say, to me, built for this is,
All right, welcome everybody to another episode of Built for This, Stories of a Maverick. On this episode today, we're gonna delve into the transformative journey of Paolo Gaudiano, whose unique background in aerospace engineering and neuroscience has propelled him into the forefront of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And as the founder of Aleria and author of Measuring Inclusion, Paolo brings a data-driven approach to creating more inclusive and equitable workplaces. So today we're going to explore his path from academia to entrepreneurship and the challenges of quantifying inclusion and actionable insights for organizations to foster genuine inclusivity. Welcome.
thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here, Jenna. I really appreciate it.
Amazing. And like everybody, I always love to start with kind of the beginning of where we all began. So I would love to sort of understand, how you grew up and a little bit more about your sort of history coming from Italy into the United States.
Absolutely happy to do that. And I do like to start always, when I talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, I like to talk about the fact that I jokingly refer to myself as the white elephant in the room. What is a white male, cisgender, heterosexual person doing talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion? And a lot of that comes partly because of my background of growing up in Italy, but a lot of it is because I came into this space from an unusual background, which is about analytics, etc. And I'll tell you more about that. But I came to the United States when I was 16. My parents were on vacation, not on vacation. My dad was a visiting professor for the summertime in Santa Barbara, and I then had the opportunity to stay and finish high school in the U.S. And I found that I enjoyed it a lot more than I enjoyed the Italian school system. And that's how I came to be here. I ended up, I thought, well, I'll finish high school, then go back to Italy. Then I thought, well, I'll do college, then go back to Italy. Then I got married, had kids, got divorced, you got remarried, and I'm still here. So I spent a lot of time in Italy, and that really has shaped a lot of my background and appreciation of the importance of diversity and inclusion. But it's, nonetheless, it's a critical part of who I am and how I got here.
I love that. And kind of growing up, do you come from seeing sort of a little bit of that entrepreneurial journey through your parents, or sort of maybe what sparks the interest kind of as you started to begin your academic pursuits and moving into sort of your path of choice during that time?
Well, my parents, I think that they engendered in me a passion for travel and adventure and being exposed to different cultures. We never really openly talked about diversity and inclusion. Growing up in Italy was a little bit weird because I remember coming to this country and having some experiences that exposed me to race differences and race tensions here in the US, and thinking that was very weird. In Italy, we're not racist at all. And then growing up, I realized that it's not that we were not racist, it's just that there was like no racial diversity. It turns out that, in fact, unfortunately, my fellow Italians can be quite racist in many different contexts. And so I had the fortune of not being exposed or not being in an environment where people were bigoted or prejudiced, and instead the fact that we traveled a lot, the fact that we saw parts of the world and different cultures, and my parents were quite open to that, really had a profound impact on me. And in fact, I was personally interested in diversity, equity, and inclusion for a long time. And but I always felt like I'm a white guy. What can I do? I'm not one of these. I'm not exactly an activist. I've gone to a few marches. And so eventually I had this light bulb moment about 10 years ago when I saw the opportunity to combine my work and my background, my multifaceted background, with my passion for diversity and inclusion. That was in 2015. And the rest, as they say, is history.
And so talk to me about the path of kind of going into aerospace engineering and neuroscience, because generally if you hear those two words, diversity and equity and inclusion, is not really usually in the same wheelhouse, nor would it be a career trajectory that would naturally connect in a lot of ways. So kind of what was early professional experiences like, and then kind of what led you into sort of founding Aleria?
Yeah, and it's funny because I like to joke in my bio that I've done both rocket science and brain surgery, which are both actually true. I've not done brain surgery on people, but I have actually worked on the brains of different kinds of animals. And rocket science, my master's degree was in aerospace engineering, although at the time I already had started to be really interested in how the brain works from kind of an engineering perspective. And my background in kind of mathematics, computer science, engineering really gave me an appreciation for a strong analytical, logical approach to solving problems. And then my work in neuroscience brought me to the unique analytical work that I do, which is about understanding how do you connect the behaviors of individual elements in a system with what happens at the level of the macroscopic system. And in the first case, when I was studying computational neuroscience, I was fascinated by how the brain can essentially accumulate thousands, millions, even billions of neurons that individually are not very powerful devices. But when you combine them, you can do things like seeing and speaking and moving your hands. And if you're Italian like me, you do it a lot more. And I used an approach that really understood the behaviors of the individual neurons, but then used computer simulations to understand what happens when you combine a lot of neurons in a particular way. And eventually, that methodology was what brought me to study. I kind of moved it one level up. And after leaving my academic career, I was a professor for almost 10 years. I decided to become an entrepreneur, and I spent about 15 years with a company where we used a very similar idea, but now our computer simulations were looking at how people interact within organizations, within a city, within a society, to give rise to the kinds of societal phenomena, let's say organizational behavior phenomena that we're used to, and trying to understand how those two things are connected quantitatively. And then 10 years ago, I had that light bulb moment where I was sitting you would always go to these sessions on diversity and inclusion at conferences, and always wondered, how do you reconcile the very detailed experiences that people share because of their skin color, because of their gender?
Mhm.
And on the other hand, when you look at the solutions that people propose, they were very vague,
Yeah.
like, oh, we need to dismantle systemic racism. We need
Mhm.
to change the hearts and minds of corporate America. And literally one afternoon, I was sitting in one of the sessions and I was contemplating, how do you close that gap between those two? And I thought, well, wait a second. This is what I've been doing for my entire professional life. And maybe I can apply what I've learned through my academic career, my entrepreneurial career. I'd also been involved with a nonprofit. I've been involved with working with corporations and governments. And I thought, okay, let me do some research and see if this is something that has legs.
Yeah.
And really, my initial goal was, can I find a quantitative way to show leaders how the way that the company treats its employees has an impact on the financial success of the company? Because I firmly believe that until we have a strong argument that's not based on statistical data across multiple companies, but that tells an individual leader how their company's performance is impacted, it's going to be very difficult to convince them. And so I was able to do that. I built a computer simulation. I realized I was onto something really exciting. And then I started Aleria in 2017, and also started a research nonprofit called ARC. I started an academic research center, an academic conference, and that was about 10 years ago. Almost 10 years. Well, 10 years ago I started the work, and 8 years ago I founded Aleria.
And I'm curious, before, and you mentioned kind of leaving sort of the academics and professor world, did you always know that probably there was that, like, I call it that entrepreneurial fire of like, I want to kind of work outside the confines of academia? Because a lot of professors, especially depending in universities, you get tenure status. That's going to be kind of your life. You might go to like some research avenues, but generally you're kind of staying really in that world because, you're passionate about it, but there's definitely a comfort and security that comes with that. Entrepreneurship, as we know, you don't know if it's going to work. There's an element of risk that like my idea might not be as good as I think it's going to be, or I might not get the uptake I hope for. But was there anything that kind of just really solidified, that for you, that like, I have to make this move to go see what this is all about?
Yeah, well, you're spot on, and actually, it's funny because you talk about the comfort of being in academia and being tenured. I got tenure, so I became a professor in 1991 and got tenure in 1997, and then I was there. I remained a professor until late 1999, but I'd always been very entrepreneurial from a young age. I remember when I was growing up as a young teenager in a town called L'Aquila in the center of Italy. A friend of mine and I were raising pigeons and then selling pigeon eggs, and we would go fishing and sell fish to restaurants. And then later, when I came to the United States, I really got into cars. In fact, I thought my career was going to be as an automotive engineer. And with a friend of mine, we bought an old car that had body damage. It had water in the engine, and we fixed the engine, we fixed the body. And then after doing 1 year of college in the US, I took the money that my parents had sent me for my second year of tuition and actually started an auto body shop with a friend of mine. And we actually fixed cars for almost a year. So I was always very entrepreneurial, but I also loved teaching. I loved research. So academia felt like a really, really good fit for me. And I kind of went on, I learned a lot of things. And then as a professor, I found that I really could feel the call of entrepreneurship. I was a consultant for a few companies. And then eventually what happened is that I was invited to join a startup that was of German origins, but had opened an office in Boston where I was a professor. And they invited me to be their chief scientist. And it was kind of an AI-ish related company early on. We're talking about like late 90s here. And I asked my chair, could I get a leave of absence and go do this for a year or two? And he said no. And I said, okay, well then you can take my tenure and, do with it whatever you will. And I left. And I really felt very much of a sense of relief because as much as and by the way, even though I left, I maintained the tie with the university.
Yeah.
I continued to work with some graduate students that were finishing their PhDs. And then subsequent to that, I've been an adjunct at Tufts University, at City College of New York, at NYU more recently. So I still love that aspect of it. But what I didn't like about academia, at least the way that I saw it, was that not enough sense of urgency. You get funding for a grant, and then if the project goes well, great. And if it doesn't, you apply for another grant and you just keep going. And I love being interdisciplinary. I worked on so many different fields as a young professor, and my colleagues would sometimes criticize me for that. They would say, "Oh, you're not very serious because you've gotten grants in 5 different research areas."
You haven't specialized. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So ultimately led me to leave my academic career. And I can tell you, I've never regretted. I mean, there are times like right now when the DEI world is literally on fire and we're losing clients left and right and things are very scary, when a little bit of stability would be nice.
For sure.
But I've not really missed that, and here I am, 30, whatever, 25 years later, and I'm still very glad that I made believe that I made the right decision in leaving academia.
Yeah, and I think what really stands out about that is just more of the curiosity of having that one like appetite to love to learn and always explore new things. But also, I think it's really great when people hit that point where it is kind of the yes or no, where you get an opportunity and you're faced with like, I can't have both. I can't take a leave of absence, explore that, and maybe come back. And you have that visceral feeling, I like to say, in your body where you kind of almost somatically know where you either kind of back away and you stay in your comfort box, or you go, okay, and I'm out. And
Yeah,
then you let this whole other kind of path to begin. So you now
absolutely.
get to explore and, you've been in the consultant world. You're now ready to open up your own business and take everything you've learned and do it kind of your way. Talk to me about kind of the building of that, kind of maybe we'll call it the triumphs and maybe some of the roller coaster moments that have led you to sort of where you're at today.
There have been many roller coaster moments, and so when I started Aleria, I did something that was a little bit counterintuitive, which is that when you're told, when you talk to venture capitalists, when you talk to professionals that are doing startups, they always tell you the same thing, which is that focus on one thing and one thing only. And I did something different, which is that I started 3 entities at the same time. I started, as I said, a research nonprofit. I started Aleria, which is a for-profit, but it's a benefit, or it's called a benefit corporation. So we're a public benefit, which means that it's not like a B Corp; it's actually a legal entity. And then I also started some, the academic research, the nonprofit, and the for-profit. So why did I do that? Well, I did that because having been through a couple of startups, having been through academia, having had some familiarity with the nonprofit world, I realized that I needed kind of what I call the three-legged stool. I needed to have the ability to manage different parts of the work that I was doing in different entities. I saw the nonprofit as an opportunity first to tap into some funding, which in fact, the first few years of our work, we were supported fairly extensively by some foundations, and having the access to foundation money was critical, especially in the early stages. The
Mhm.
for-profit was more about thinking about the commercial implications of what I wanted to do. And then the academic work has always been really important to me. In fact, I'm still running an annual it's a research conference that is not strictly academic, but it involves academia as well. And
Right.
so that already was a little bit out of the ordinary. And
Mhm.
then, the way that I was doing the work was also very, very different from the way that most people in diversity, equity, and inclusion were doing their work.
Hmm.
In particular, the fact that it was using this really, really quantitative approach was kind of out of the ordinary.
Yeah.
And that really helped me to separate myself, not separate myself, but really was kind of a very strong differentiator in the kind of work that we do, the kind of clients we've been able to work with, and the
Hmm.
trajectory that we've been able to follow. And
Yeah.
so that was sort of how we started it. In terms of roller coasters, I've been through so many startups, and you never know what's going to happen. In my case, I had kind of an interesting situation where after starting the company, I brought on a couple of colleagues that as co-founders, and then I never wanted to be CEO. So one of the people I was hoping would be CEO of the company, and eventually handed over the reins. And then I had a very rough personal period for from late 2020 until late 2021, and so I really had to step out of the company.
Hmm.
And when I was kind of ready to get back in, my colleagues had really taken the company, very well. They'd gone to the TechStars Accelerator, and it became clear that it wasn't necessarily sensible for me to get back into a leadership role in the company. And so I agreed to basically step back and stay out of the company. And
Mm.
then, unfortunately, and started to think about, okay, I'll go on to a career doing public speaking, writing a book, and continue to promote that work. So I was still chief scientist, but I was in a reduced role. And then, unfortunately, in July of 2023, with the backlash already in fairly full swing, my colleagues that were having a really, really hard time raising capital, and the company was just not doing very well. And so, in the end, my colleagues were unable to stick around, and they, basically had to decide: do I keep the company alive on my own, or do I shut it down? And I decided, you know what, I'm gonna dive in head first and try to salvage it. And I was doing great in 2024. And
Yeah.
then, of course, 2025 hit, and here we are. So it's
Yeah.
been literally like a multi-stage roller coaster.
No doubt. And talk to me a little bit more about sort of the approach to DEI. Obviously, I mean, it's been an interesting topic of conversation for a while now in different capacities, and a little bit more of a different context, obviously in the current environment. But kind of talk to me about sort of how you looked at it versus how other people were looking at it, and a means to identify and actually really solve the issue.
I think that the fact that I came into it with two very, very different elements than most people, one being white, male, cisgender, heterosexual, which does two things for me, right? The being white has two implications. One of them is that I will never know what it's like to be a woman. I will never know what it's like to be black. I will never know what it's like to be Asian. But I also get a benefit from it, which is that I get in front of people who look like me.
Isn't it?
And the majority of corporate leaders tend to look like me. And
Mhm.
that gives me an insight into how corporate leaders think. Not only that, but I get to hear things from people behind closed doors that, quite frankly, even some of my really good friends who are chief diversity officers, who speak directly to CEOs, they will not hear the same things in the same way that I do. And so it really puts me, by surrounding myself with amazing people who do not look like me, trying to educate myself, trying to be humble and realize that there's a lot that I don't know. I've been able to effectively work almost like as a go-between, where I've been able to act as a bit of a membrane between the two sides. And a lot of my work is characterized by the fact that I tend to take a fairly neutral stance, and I tend to be able to understand and appreciate both sides of the arguments, and point out both the strengths and the weaknesses. And then the second thing, so that was about more about my identity and
Yep.
my approach. But the second thing that was very unique was the analytical approach. And one thing that it's the only thing in my life that I've ever predicted anything with any degree of accuracy is in 2018, after I've been working in the space for a few years, I had become convinced that the focus on diversity as the only measure and the only goal and the only target was
Mhm.
going to be a really big problem. And I wrote an article in April of 2018 in Forbes, so this is public domain, in which I said the title was, "Here's why companies need to stop focusing on diversity." And what I said was, if we continue to focus on diversity alone as the only metric, we're going to see backlash from white men complaining about reverse discrimination, and it may spread to other parts of society like affirmative action. Now, I said that 2 years, 1 month, and 23 days before the murder of George Floyd, which, by the way, we recently celebrated the fifth anniversary of that tragic incident. And and how did I know that? Well, I knew that because when I started to look at the not just the data, but these computer simulations made it very clear that the problem is not so much the identity of people in an organization, but it's what are the day-to-day experiences that
Mhm.
people have as a function of those characteristics. And
Mhm.
so we became aware very quickly that knowing the diversity level of companies was only kind of an indicator of the symptoms. It's like
Right.
walking into your house in the winter, feeling cold, you look at the thermostat, it says 50 degrees. Oh, I know how to fix it. I'm going to light a match under the thermostat.
Yeah.
Well, meanwhile, the windows are drafty, the front door is open, and the roof is leaking, and you may burn your fingers or burn the whole house down.
Mhm.
And that's exactly what we've done. The thermostat in this case is the level of diversity of a company. If diversity is low, it means that there are problems. But just stuffing more people, creating, supposedly in the US, quotas are illegal. But when you call them targets, I mean, it's kind of hard to tell the difference, really. And what ends up happening is that you're basically upsetting a lot of people. You're telling people, oh, you have been unjustly taking advantage of the system. You are, you're basically someone that is discriminating. And if you're not an anti-racist, then you're racist. You attack people, you
Mhm.
make them feel guilty, and then you try to solve the problem in the wrong way. And
Mhm.
so my focus was really on how do we understand the specific experiences that people have. And that's what we realized was what inclusion, one way of thinking about inclusion. And so we developed this unique method to measure inclusion by asking people to share very specific experiences. And we're very careful. We don't say experiences that made you feel excluded, because that's already a loaded
Yeah.
question, because it assumes that we know why
They
you feel the
happen.
way
Yeah.
you feel. Exactly. Instead, it's things like, we ask, there can be things like, I didn't get invited to a meeting where a decision was made that impacted me. Or it could be something like, I took my laptop to the IT department and it took them 3 months to fix it. Now, when we collect the data, if we find that a lot of people complain about the IT department being slow and that it happens a lot more to women than to men, then we know that the company is not being inclusive. And more importantly, we can point the company and say, you have a problem. Here's what the problem looks like. Here's what people are saying is the problem. Here's how many people are impacted. And here's what you can do to fix it. And when you do that, and then you tie it to the financial side, and I can tell you more about how we do that, it completely revolutionizes the conversation. It's no longer about, oh, you should feel guilty about how you're treating women. It's about, you have a group of people that are less satisfied and it's costing you money. We can tell you exactly what is happening. We can tell you why it has nothing to do with your skills and it's just damaging you. And we can tell you how to fix it.
I find that fascinating because I think from my experience, working in startups, depending again, the approach, the personality coming in, it's one thing to look at, you'll say like, we need to build a diverse team. Okay, well, like, what does that mean? What backgrounds are we looking for? What skill sets are we looking for? We can't have everybody, like you said, looking the same, talking the same, all thinking the same, although in a certain level and in certain companies that definitely is a trend where everybody does have that, again, but can affect them in really negative ways. So looking at it from more of, it's kind of almost like a culture survey in a way versus like identifying it with, this is a DEI issue. So so you get a survey, you get all the feedback in, and how do you actually correlate that to obviously an ROI or where the numbers are going to speak? And then it's some ears perk up definitely a little bit more when those things are said.
Well, we realized, and I'm going to come back in a moment. I want to make some comments later about the idea of diverse teams and the value of diverse teams and things like
Yeah.
that. But to go back to the ROI, what we realized again is the data that people have used to argue for the business case of diversity, quote unquote,
Hmm.
usually looks at high level correlations. Oh, companies that have higher diversity in their executive teams tend to have greater financial performance along these two metrics.
Hmm.
Aside from the fact that some of those data there, some of the studies have been challenged as being actually not very good, there is another problem, which is that, first of all, correlation does not imply causation. What does that mean? Well, that means simply that just because you see two things happening together, you have no idea whether one causes the other or the other one causes the first thing, or whether there may be a common thing that causes both of them to happen. So
Hmm.
arguing that even if there was a correlation, arguing that diversity leads to better performance is like arguing that, oh, hey, I did a study in which I measured tooth color and looked at a correlation with lung cancer.
Hmm.
And lo and behold, I'm going to sell you a tooth whitener because that's going to remove lung cancer. Well, clearly that would not make any sense whatsoever, right? You would say, well, you probably have yellow teeth because you smoke and that causes lung cancer, right? But what we don't realize is that when we make an argument that just because correlations show that diversity may increase performance, saying that diversity causes performance is just, it's silly. It's wishful thinking. There is really nothing to that. But more importantly, leaders don't use correlations over thousands of companies to make decisions about what to do.
Yeah.
Imagine a company doing a study and finding out that, oh, on average, when we look at the color of products, we find that red colors tend to do slightly better than blue colors. So what do? You're going to create every single product in your company is going to be red. Of course, that's not how you run companies, right?
Hmm.
So instead, here's what we realized. let's say that you have two groups of people in your company. And for simplicity, let's say that it's white people and people of color.
Yep.
And let's say that white people have a level of satisfaction of 90%, whatever that means.
Mm-hmm.
And people of color have a level of satisfaction of 70%. That will have two very material implications on the success of your company. First, it is a very well documented fact that any individual that is less satisfied will perform less well. They will be less productive, their quality of work will decline, etc. Which means that they're generating fewer revenues for you and less and lower quality products and services, etc. That immediately impacts your top line because it reduces your revenues. Secondly, we also know that there's an incredibly strong correlation, actually a causal link between the level of satisfaction and your retention rates. So what that means is that those people of color are going to be more likely to leave the company, and that's going to cost you a lot of money. And we know that the cost of replacing an employee can be easily a year's worth of salary. Depending on the level, it can be more, it can be less, but it's on average close to a year's worth of salary, which means that if you are causing some group of people in your organization to be unable to perform at their peak simply because of identity traits that have nothing to do with their work, you're shooting yourself in the foot because you're bleeding money by reducing your revenues and increasing your costs. And we've actually built a simple calculator that can estimate for a typical company, once we know their identity groups, if we have any indication of their relative levels of satisfaction, we can estimate how much money they're losing. And those numbers are very big. We believe that most companies are losing somewhere between 20 and 30% of their net profits simply because of the fact that they're not treating everybody the same. So when you come up with an argument like that and you go to a company and you say, your company's losing $10 million a year simply by virtue of the fact that you've not figured out how to make sure that women are included in all the meetings at the same level as men, or that people of color are promoted at the same rate as white people, etc., we can help you to identify what exactly is happening that is causing those differences in satisfaction, and we can tell you how to fix it. And if you do that, here's how much money you can stand to gain, which you can see is a completely different argument. It's not sprinkle magic diversity dust and your company will magically do better. It's like you are losing money today that you don't realize that you're losing. We can help you to find where you're leaking out that money, stop the gaps, and fix that.
And where do you think in terms of, is there a certain employee headcount size where, you would focus on, or when you look at an entrepreneur building a company, what are kind of the common mistakes that you're seeing in terms of when they're adding a bunch of the people to the team and how they're actually running it?
That's a brilliant question. And actually, we've found we've done a significant amount of work on the educational side for startups and explaining why, even from the startup level, you need to think about some of these issues. When it comes to actually measuring inclusion, we need to have enough data that it really makes sense to link it to ROI and things of that sort. So that tends to work better with larger companies. For smaller companies, the thing that people have to realize, and we've actually built computer simulations to capture this, the way that a company grows is influenced fairly dramatically by what happens in its first few months or years of existence. So if you start out and you just kind of blindly, I'm going to hire the first person that I know who happens to be my roommate from college, lo and behold, they look exactly like me. It's okay to do that as long as you're aware of the fact that you're going to have some blind spots and that you make an effort to make sure that you have an inclusive mindset. And again, the way that we work with companies, that we can show them kind of what that means, what are typical mistakes that companies make. And if you do that and you're mindful of that and you make the effort early on to start hiring people that bring different lived experiences, that's going to help you not only to kind of expand sort of the whole diversity of thought idea, which I think has some limitations, but it's not an unreasonable argument. But more importantly, it makes it more likely that somebody will notice, like let's say that you hire your first woman in the company and you're all men. And it's like, well, the woman might point out that, there are issues with childcare. There are issues with menopause. There are issues with, there are a lot of different kinds of issues that a guy would just not think about. Oh, let's have all of our all hands meetings at 7:30 in the morning. It's like, well, that's great if you're a single guy or if you're married and your wife takes care of the kids. But so even just having somebody that can point out to you that, hey, maybe there is a better way to do it, and getting you into that more welcoming and open-minded way of thinking that can be tremendously helpful for the younger companies. When you embed that kind of thinking in the earlier stages, what we have found, and we have both computer simulations and data that show that you're much more likely to grow a company that is more diverse and where the employees tend to be more satisfied, you tend to have higher retention rates, and you can, that all of those things actually support your bottom line as well.
Mm. And what about, I guess in this, there's always an outlier where I think you have executives that love the idea of it, invite people in to give them, hey, here's where you need to get better. Here's what you would need to do it. But I would say sometimes old habits die hard. And if you've done things for a certain way, like like a neural pathway, if you've done it over and over again, you're automatically going to go kind of that way more naturally versus create a new neural pathway of doing and thinking differently. What are kind of some maybe common objectives or resistance that maybe you've experienced and how to really support them kind of getting through that? Or even just, I would imagine getting such concrete awareness of like, you don't even realize you're doing, and here's how we have to catch you.
Yeah, and again, another brilliant question. And one of the things that I talk about in my book, and that it kind of describe, I don't want to say I discovered it, but it was sort of an inevitable conclusion as we were doing our research, is that we have an analogy where we draw a parallel between inclusion in an organization and health. By that I mean, if you think about, when we introduced ourselves, right? I didn't say, hi, I'm Paolo and I'm very healthy. Why? Well, because now, I'm healthy and I tend not to notice when I'm healthy. But if I'd had a cough or if I'd had, a patch on my eye or something, that might have come up in the conversation. So we notice when we are unhealthy more easily than we notice when we're healthy. Inclusion works the same way. We're much more likely to notice when we're being excluded, when something negative is happening, than when we are included all the time. Now, that has a very important implication.
Yeah.
If you're very healthy, you don't know a lot about diseases. You may not know the name of a disease. If somebody tells you the name, you will not know what the symptoms are. And even if somebody tells you the symptoms, you may not appreciate how severe they are, and you certainly are not qualified to heal that disease.
Right.
Well, same thing is true with inclusion. If you're included all the time, you don't know what exclusion means, you don't know what the symptoms are, you don't know how severe they are, and you surely are not qualified to fix the problem. But guess what? Whereas we all tend to experience health issues kind of uniformly across the population, who are the most included people in a company? It's the white, male, cisgender, heterosexual leaders with no disabilities,
Right.
which means that the very people that are in charge of making decisions for everyone are the ones that are least able to understand what exclusion means, to know what it feels like, to understand the severity of it, and to know what to do about it. And I can tell you that a lot of the guys, and I say guys quite literally because I speak to leaders that are both male and female, but a lot of the men who have literally never experienced any significant form of workplace exclusion, they have no clue. And so what's happened, especially after the murder of George Floyd, what ended up happening is that from the point of view of a lot of these people, they couldn't see what was actually happening.
Yeah.
They would hear stories, but it's like, well, is this really, are people exaggerating? And then on top of that, they start getting yelled at about, oh, you're an oppressor and you're doing this wrong. And now, we're going to boycott you and all these things. And they're freaking out. They're like, nobody's telling me what to do. Like, you're all telling me what is wrong with what I'm doing. You're telling me that I'm a bad person, that I have to change my behaviors, that all the men in my company have to change behaviors, that I have to start hiring more people, even though I don't know how to treat them, et cetera, et cetera. And so that ended up leaving a lot of people in an uncomfortable situation. I think it's less because of the resistance to the ideas, and it's more because we really have not given them the right arguments and, more importantly, the right tools to show them what to do. I know a ton of white male leaders who, given the opportunity to do the right thing, would be delighted to do so. Now, just to be very clear, there are some real a-holes out there. There are some really badly prejudiced, bigoted, just really, really not pleasant human beings out there, including some members of the leadership and very often, throughout the ranks of a company. I am not suggesting that these people are not there. And unfortunately, when you create an environment where people are frustrated because they're being told that they can't be promoted because first you have to promote a woman or a person of color, you create an environment where now all of a sudden people are going to be much more susceptible to complaints by people who are bigoted, who are prejudiced. And I think that's actually why the backlash has been so strong. It's because, unfortunately, unwittingly, a lot of the DEI activities in the few years following George Floyd were unfortunately kind of misguided because they focused too much on the problems and on the blaming people and not enough on the solutions. And when we had solutions, there were things like unconscious bias training, which literally says, you are a bad person and I'm going to try to fix you, which
Yeah.
is really, really, really the wrong way to go about it. And unfortunately, that created this fertile environment for some people to come back and start to use DI as a derogatory term, to
Right.
take terms like woke and use them as an insult.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, everybody's like, oh my God, we poor white people are getting discriminated against and it's horrible and it's unfair and we need to eliminate all of it. And
Well, it kind of
unfortunately, yeah.
Yeah, it kind of brings up, and I mean, it's always something when people are jumping in to be reactive versus proactive, right? You're kind of missing the point, and you're not really thinking things through, and it's that knee-jerk reaction. And it almost is very similar in a sense to like the Me Too movement, starting from a good place, and you get a few different people that are not in it for the right reason, and it blows up, and the whole original purpose of why it was there in the first place, and who we need to bring together to like propel just better behavior and everybody coming together for the greater good got disbanded a bit. And that's what I feel. And when you brought up kind of health versus not healthy and recognizing symptoms, and it comes up a lot in discussions about performance. Every entrepreneur wants high performers. They want grit, they want resilience, they want agility, and they want somebody who can always push that line. And it's interesting that if their only experience has been in their life that they've been able to do it and deliver at that kind of level, there's this instant frustration with wanting to rip those people out that can't hit those marks right away, or have some issues that might slow them down a little bit, but need a different level of support, but are still very valuable. So how do you approach a conversation where just like, I guess the non-negotiable is like, I want A players, I want top performers. And if you can't meet it, you're out.
Yeah. So, when I talk about my having done rocket science and brain surgery, I usually follow that by saying neither of those prepared me for how complex and difficult it would be to work in DEI. And you're kind of,
People are very complex.
yeah. And in fact, I have a kind of my own personal newsletter on LinkedIn called the complexity of diversity and inclusion or complexity of inclusion. And you're talking about a canonical example of that, which is the complexity of, we think as human beings that we can tell what works and what doesn't work. And unfortunately, there are a couple of mistakes that people very often make when they're making decisions about who to hire. First one is that they tend to give too much weight to what they see as their own skills that have contributed to their success. And they fail to realize that often their success has been due to a number of factors, including luck. And that assuming that just because somebody behaves like them or has gone to the same schools or has the same skills and characteristics that they will do well.
Yeah.
But there is a second point, which is something where I challenge a lot of leaders, both in startups and larger companies. If you're going to tell me that you know how to select the best candidate, but you have not established a quantitative measurement of the success of these people through the years and tracked it over the years and proven that the characteristics that you think are strong are actually impacting your bottom line and top line positively, then you're just, I was going to say something vulgar, I will not say something vulgar, but you're just making stuff up, okay? And that's something that people do not understand. There was a famous article when Alexander Wang, the founder of Scale AI, published a post in which he said, oh, I don't believe it's not about DEI, my company is very much about meritocracy. We need to have merit, excellence, and intelligence. And then he goes on to talk about how he wants a meritocracy, and then he talks about how he uses those criteria to decide who they're going to hire. I am sorry, meritocracy is not about hiring. When you're talking about hiring, you're talking about candidate selection. Period. End of story. If you're going to tell me that choosing the right people for the job is meritocracy, I am sorry, but you don't know what the hell you're talking about. It's an ignorant comment, which shows to me something that I've been arguing against lately, which is that meritocracy without measurement is an ideology. And the people that go around touting meritocracy without putting numbers on it are full of crap. I'm sorry, but they don't know what they're talking about. And this is something that I really have been encouraging people to do. In fact, some of my recent work, I say, look, people are saying that meritocracy is like the opposite of DEI. That's completely wrong. What DEI people truly want is a meritocracy. But they want a true meritocracy for all, not a meritocracy for the buddy who went to the same school or whose daddy played in the same golf club as my daddy played. And unfortunately, meritocracy, the way that it's implemented in most companies, is not meritocracy at all because nobody measures it. It's like, oh, I hired that guy from Yale and he did very well. And by the way, most of those people, if another guy from Yale fails, they never say, oh, he failed because he went to Yale. They never say, oh, he failed because he's white. Oh,
Yeah.
he failed because he's a man. Never.
Yeah.
But if you get a job and you don't do well, oh, Jenna failed because she's a woman. We tried it with women, it didn't work out. That black guy that we hired, oh, of course, that black guy, you hired somebody that maybe didn't have the right qualifications. You put him in a job that he was not prepared for. You did not help him at all. And worst of all, you put him in an environment where people disliked him.
Yeah.
They attacked him, they denigrated him, and then you wonder why that person didn't do well. In fact, even if he was
Set
super
them up to
qualified,
fail.
and so this
Yeah.
is the complexity. People are, and by the way, the work that I do comes from a field called complexity science. And one of the things that is known in the study of complex systems is that it is virtually impossible for our brains to understand how a complex system works. So, for example, a stock market, why is it that nobody can actually systematically beat the stock market? We all know what everybody's doing. We all know people are buying, people are selling, and yet we cannot figure it out. Even things like sports, even understanding what's going to happen in a match between two teams in any sport is virtually impossible. That's why gamblers, make or lose so much money, because we are completely incapable of mentally understanding what's going to happen in a complex system. Every company on the planet, every organization on the planet is a complex system.
Yeah.
And when I hear people making these, boasting about how, oh, they know how to select the best candidates, I'm sorry, show me the numbers or shut up. And I get so frustrated with people when they use that as an excuse to criticize DEI, when
Yeah.
you could take exactly the same criticism and use them to show that what they're doing is profoundly flawed and it's profoundly lacking in any merit whatsoever. And it's really just an illusion. It's just an ideology.
Yeah. And what is your take in terms of, I've experienced a lot of people, and I do think behavioral assessments are useful when used the right way to kind of understand. But I've definitely experienced, you can do your benchmark and markers, and it's like, our ideal person is in this benchmark in all these 10 traits. If they're not in it, they're not what we're looking for. They can't do the job, which I don't think is true for everybody. I think it's a data point of use, but then you actually need to kind of test for some other things. So I'm curious if there's sort of maybe, and I'll call it a assessment tool in general that you use, if any, to support kind of candidate measurement or data points, or if you just think that that's just not at all useful.
Well, again, I have to say, I really, really love the questions that you're asking, and I appreciate just how thoroughly you've thought about these issues. There are sort of two answers that I want to give to that. The first one is that, again, I find that nobody that I know of, or virtually nobody that I know of, ever follows up their rigorous, let's put a matrix of what we, or a spreadsheet with a checklist of who's actually good, who's not good. Do they follow it up by seeing historically how people have actually done in the company? And the answer is no. So when you, again, you get a bunch of people in the room, it's like, well, what do we need? We need grit, we need stamina, we need determination. How do we measure that? Well, we have an interview and look, we asked this guy, how many linear feet can he descend them a ski slope in 25 minutes, and you're like, oh, wow, look at this. This guy was like, giant slalom winner or whatever, right? And instead of then saying, are these, first of all, how do these characteristics actually impact everyone in the workplace? Because by the way, in the workplace, we're not alone. So you can be on paper a phenomenal candidate, but if you're a complete jerk and you make half of your team feel horrible and a third of them quit after a year because of the way that you behave, you as a company, that person may have sold a lot of stuff for you, and on paper they made a lot of money, but they probably lost you 10 times as much money by basically upsetting the entire ecosystem around them. So there is that fundamental problem. Now, does that mean that you should stop measuring? Absolutely not. But I would suggest two things. The first one is to be a bit more flexible and to think about not just the specific characteristics that are related to accomplishing a particular task, but how those people are going to behave within the organization. What is going to be their impact on other people? Are they going to be team players? It's kind of like in sports, right? You want to have a bench player on teams that maybe is very good in the locker room, that actually can, cheer people on and make them. You don't want, like, if you were playing American football, you don't want all quarterbacks. If you're playing, international football or soccer, you don't want all, scorers. You need to have goalies and defenders and everything like that. And I think that most people, I would encourage them to think about that. And then the second thing that I want to say is that one of the projects that I did actually before founding Aleria, when I was working at this company called Ecosystem, we did what was probably my first ever project related to DI, but at the time I didn't even know that's what I was doing. But we worked through the Kellogg Foundation. We received the grant to understand how we can help young people from socioeconomically disadvantaged areas gain employment in a way that is going to lead to better than just a dead-end job. And this is a huge problem because entry-level employment as you know, you have the problem that you don't have any way of evaluating a candidate. And so what a lot of companies will do, they'll say like, what was your GPA? Did you finish high school or have a GED or equivalent? And do you have a criminal record? And that's basically all they can say. So the Kellogg Foundation had worked with a nonprofit in Baltimore that was essentially educating young adults from inner city Baltimore on how to behave during job interviews and jobs, etc. And
Yeah.
they had identified a whole series of soft skills beyond just their actual skills. And what they were proposing to companies was, oh, instead of using these three metrics, like, whatever your GPA, whether, et cetera, et cetera, here's a list of like 50 some. And there were things like, do you have a car? Do you have a bank account? Are you a single parent? Do you live in a safe environment? And things of that sort, right? And they had this idea of taking those and calculating a number. One of the things that we said, look, this is the wrong way to think about it.
Mhm.
The idea that there is an absolute quality or quantity, I should say, associated with each person is forgetting the fact that a single person can perform very, very differently in two different environments. And conversely, two
Yeah.
different people can perform very much the same depending on what the environment looks like. What does that mean? Well, that means that if you, for example, are hiring a young kid to work in a warehouse, and this is somebody who loves to be in touch with people and be outdoors, they're going to be miserable. Conversely, if you hire somebody who hates talking to people and you put them in a customer service, role, that's going to be horrible. So what we did is that we built a computer simulation in which literally we played out what would happen in a typical day-to-day work for the first year of a young person going into a new job. But what we needed to know was two things. What are the characteristics of the company and the job? And what are the characteristics of the youth? And what we found was that some youth were ideally suited to some jobs and not to others, and that some companies were great for some youths and not for others. And I would love people to understand the same thing, which is that this idea that there is like a perfect candidate is just stupid. It's like you can take the best candidate on the planet, put them in an adverse situation, and they will fail. And this, by the way, goes back to what I was saying before. I hear so many people, it's like, oh, we tried to hire a woman as a VP of engineering, and it was just an utter failure. And when people tell me that, I'm like, let me ask you a question. Did you do anything to make that person feel welcome? And have you ever had any men failing in those positions before, right? And people don't think about that. They don't think about the fact that the success of any individual has nothing, no, not nothing. It has as much to do with the environment in which they operate as it does with their actual innate skills. And so that's the other thing and I'm sorry, this was a very lengthy answer to your very good question, but it's like we need to stop thinking, like a FICO score, like, oh, you are an 815, I'm a 729. It's like that makes zero sense. Let's learn to see how people did really well and also evaluate some of the less tangible aspects of people's performance as human beings, if you will, understand how that impacts the well-being not only of themselves but also of the entire organization.
No, I agree with you. And I often get in like discussions, especially in like talent acquisition. And I'm like, I understand from a paper perspective, this candidate doesn't look as good as this one. But here, from a personality perspective, of why I think this person is going to be way better. And it is those intangibles from like life experiences or having to kind of work two jobs, go to school full time, got great grades, like has that grit of oration, like I will do the work and I learn quick. I don't, wasn't able to attend XYZ Ivy League school. I don't have these connections versus somebody who comes in with a really large sense of entitlement. And like I did go to Yale and I did graduate this and I want to walk on and I'm entitled to make a lot of money and like I'll just walk to the next one if you don't do it. And it's such an interesting personality clash, but then you just have people are also so attached to that like idea of this just looks and sounds better versus the reality of what personalities are going to come in and be really great people to work with and who are going to add a ton of impact to your organization. So you know, it's always a challenge and it's always what question or what is going to be the thing that helps shift the mindset for people to look at building teams differently, or we'll call it a little less traditional or in the way that they grew up. And I think that's why I feel there's this hesitation around, a little bit of investing in DEI because there's, again, like a mental shift sometimes about what that actually means and what extra work is this going to cause me and how do I, all the like what ifs and the roadblocks to it. What would you kind of say in terms of leaders, entrepreneurs who are a little bit hesitant or kind of watching the way the world's working right now with that are like, I just don't want to really touch this right now. What would you kind of say to get their minds thinking a little bit differently, but also maybe how to start stepping into that world in a more meaningful way?
Yeah. No, and if I may, I would like to tell you a little bit of an anecdote, and then I'll answer the question more directly, because something that you said really brought something to mind. Among other things, I mentioned that I was an adjunct at multiple universities. When I moved to New York from Boston, I used to be an adjunct at Tufts, and then I moved to New York, and I happened to move in Harlem, and I was like literally 2 blocks away from City College of New York. City College of New York, CCNY, is the flagship school of the CUNY system, which is the largest and most diverse urban school system in the country. They have, I think, 28 campuses, et cetera. And some of the, it used to be, City College used to be called the Harvard of the poor. And a lot of Nobel Prize laureates and people like Andy Grove, who used to be at Intel, he's passed away a few years ago, they went to City College of New York. I had students, I was teaching in a graduate program, actually in 2 different graduate programs, in computer science and in economics and business. And these people were people like you were saying. A lot of them were non-white, a lot of them were women, and all of them worked full time, often had kids at home, sometimes had 2 jobs, like work full time, drive an Uber, and take classes at night to get their master's degree. Some of these people may not have gotten 4.0 GPAs, but let me tell you something. You want hustle, you want determination, you want grit, you want a desire to succeed. These people embody that. Now, at the time, I was running another startup, and I would always go to events in Midtown that were about entrepreneurship. And all of these people, all of these company founders, pretty much 95% of them or more, white and mostly male, would complain about how difficult it was to get computer science students to hire for their companies.
Yeah.
And they would go to Columbia, they would go to NYU, and that was about it. And after that, they would go out of state. At the time, I think Columbia computer science graduates had job placement rates of something like 98%. In City College of New York, in the year that I was there, the job placement rate for computer science graduate was around 45%. And I used to tell people, it's like, can you explain to me? Columbia is on 116th in Manhattan. City College of New York is at 135. It's 20 blocks, 1 mile.
Yeah.
How is it that you guys who are complaining about not being able to find computer science talent, not getting people with great determination, are refusing to go the extra 20 blocks to find some incredibly good candidates from a place like City College of New York? So that right there is sort of indicative of the mindset. People talk about quality of talent, but in my opinion, they're letting themselves be fooled by things that really do not have any demonstrable link to quality other than, the prestige of having gone to an Ivy League school, right? Now, to go back to the question that you asked, what do I tell people? I point something out, which is there are several things that I discuss with people to make them understand why they should not be afraid of DEI. And by the way, I always point out that I'm the first to admit that DEI, as has been the way that it has been implemented for the last several years, is not particularly good. It has a lot of problems. It has the right heart, but I think the wrong implementation, and that has created problems. So I will admit that this is not a simple argument of, oh, let's do DEI, let's do it better. But here's one thing that I point out to people. If you think about the way that we manage assets as an organization, right? We have financial assets, we have marketing assets, we have products, right? These are all asset classes. For every asset classes that I can think of, we have tools that help us to do portfolio management. So what do? We use financial portfolio management to do what? To diversify our financial assets to generate better returns. We use programmatic advertising to do what? To diversify our marketing assets in order to generate greater sales. We have same things for inventory, product design, etc. When it comes to human assets, we have no tools that can tell us the impact on the organization of diversifying our assets. So already we know from every asset class we've ever touched that diversification can always lead to improvement. I mean, ultimately, the idea that whatever allocation of assets you have right now is the best in the world is silly. You know that if you mix it up, depending on your company, depending on whatever, you can do it better. So why don't we do that for human assets? Why are companies not absolutely concerned about that? The second thing that I point out is this. If you look at the balance sheet or the budget, the annual budget, let's say, of any company on the planet, people are by far the single most expensive budget item of every company on the planet. If you look at companies across the United States in 2019, and the ratio stayed fairly similar over the years, in 2019, all companies in the United States spent $250 billion on advertising. That's across every form of advertising, 250 billion. When
Yeah.
you look at the same companies in terms of payroll and benefits, they spent $7.4 trillion with a T.
Now,
So they spent 30 times as much on payroll and benefits as they did on advertising. So my question to the CEO is, how is it that you are not concerned about diversifying your human assets when it's the single largest budget item of your organization? And it's the one that's going to have the most profound impact on the success of your company. So instead of thinking of it, oh my God, I got to go out and hire Hispanics and women and LGBTQ and people with disabilities, if you just look at it as a problem of what is the best way for me to manage my assets, right away you have removed that sense of, oh, now I got to bolt something on and bolt it on here and there and there and there and there. And then from there, I have a whole kind of framework that I've been developing lately where I say, look, if you think of your human assets the way that you think about financial assets, then you should do something similar to what you do in finance, which is that in finance, you don't just have a balance sheet, right? You have P&L and you have cash flow. They tell you different things. The balance sheet tells you a snapshot of where you are, where your assets are today. That's just like diversity. So diversity is like your balance sheet of your human assets. It's just one metric of a static snapshot of where you are today. What I've been calling inclusion is like cash flow. It's the day in and day out things that increase and decrease the value of your human assets. And then what I've been calling, the P&L is what I used to call equity. Now I call it merit, right? Which is about looking at all of the processes that touch people in your organization, like promotions, performance evaluations, attending meetings, different kinds of development opportunities, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And looking over a longer period of time, like over a quarter, over a semester, over a year, looking to see where you're potentially losing people and gaining people. Just like the P&L is doing what? Well, it's looking to see what parts of your organization are losing money. So your balance sheet tells you there is a problem. Your P&L tells you this is where the problem is. And your cash flow tells you here's what you need to do to fix it. Your diversity should tell you there is a problem. Your merit or equity, where you're measuring the processes, should tell you, oh, these are where the problems are. And then your inclusion should tell you, here is what the problems look like and how to fix them. If you thought of it that way, and you gave companies the right tools so that they're simply tracking what is happening to their people, their most valuable asset, they could do infinitely better. And it's not about bolting on DI to everything. It's about simply treating your human assets the way that you treat your financial assets. And if you did that, in my opinion, it would be relatively easy. It would be a very natural thing to do. And I think that the lever that you can get, imagine if a company could increase the efficiency of the workforce by 5%. Look at your budget. I invite anybody listening to this. If you have a company, I don't care what size, look at your budget, look at what percentage of your budget is spent on people. If you could increase the proficiency of that, the performance of that by 5%, what would that do to your company? And I think that this is where, a lot of people just fail to think rationally. They just get caught up on the, oh my God, black, white, gay, lesbian. I don't know what to say. I'm going to say the wrong thing and I'm going to get crucified.
And I feel there's a patience component too, which is like we just don't have time. It's not important. Like next, fire them, get the next one. Like,
by the way, that there's a very interesting awareness that is growing in our society, which is that unfortunately a lot of decisions in corporate America are driven by accounting principles. And in accounting principles, unfortunately, people only appear on the balance sheet as a liability. You buy a computer, oh, it's an asset. You can depreciate it. And if you invest in keeping it maintained, et cetera, that's actually a good thing. You hire a person, it's a liability. You invest to train that person, it's a net cost. That creates a terrible, terrible mindset of people being just fungible liabilities. And the idea that, oh, I can just throw them out. Hey, what's the greatest thing that most private equity firms do? They go in, they buy a company, they start firing a bunch of people because look at that. Now your profitability goes up. Yeah, but meanwhile, your customer service sucks. Your product quality goes down. And, lo and behold, 2 years later, the company fails, right? I mean, it's funny because to me, it's so obvious, right? It's like, duh. But people they don't, business leaders, unfortunately, they're brought up with that mindset of, I'm going to look at accounting principles, I'm going to look at my balance sheet. And by the way, it's not just the business leaders, because you go and you do a call with Wall Street And you're going to have some analyst, some kid out of school who learned the same thing, who's going to look at your balance sheet and say, oh, why are you spending so much on personnel? Oh,
Yeah.
you fired half of your staff and now you're outsourcing it. Oh, brilliant, because it now goes into a different category of expenses and you look more profitable. That kind of mindset is disastrous. I mean, I think that that's at the heart of a lot of the problems that we're seeing. And
Yeah.
unfortunately, it's going to be really difficult to overcome because as long as boards require that and investor calls require that and the market requires that because newspapers write about that,
Yeah.
it's going to be incredibly difficult for the leader to stand up and say, no, I don't believe you. You know, look at companies like Costco, Sodexo, Apple. I mean, these are companies that have invested. They believe in making the lives of their employees better, and they all do fantastically well in terms of profitability.
Yeah.
But they're seen as outliers. It's like, oh, well, yeah, you know, we don't know how to replicate that. We're not going to do that because we know, heaven forbid, that we should raise minimum wage in this country beyond $7 and however many cents it is right now.
Yeah.
You know, heaven forbid that we should concern ourselves with the fact that most frontline workers cannot make enough money to survive on a full-time job. You know, oh, that would be terrible because otherwise companies would lose profitability. It's like, okay, well, as
Yeah.
long as we have that overarching mindset, DEI is unfortunately is always going to get trampled under the, you know, the feet of the sort of the more kind of accounting, you
Yeah.
know, monetary mindset that really fails to understand the critical role that people have in creating those financial assets for you.
Yeah, no, that's so well said. And I think there's just the ego component too of if you think of even smaller companies making really poor decisions from a people perspective right away of going after the person like there's no way you can afford them. Like, yes, they're at this point in their career and they can charge that, but what business do they have coming in right now asking for that level of money versus somebody who's got the skills that's going to grow even bigger and better into the role? If we build this in the right way versus bringing in four people that are all $500,000 more. And then, of course, you're going to cut all their teams or cut them because they're too expensive.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. I mean, as I said before, these are really, really complex problems, and they bring in societal issues and issues of guilt and issues of perception, and you know, and yeah, there's absolutely no easy answer. But I think that sometimes we get too wrapped up in issues of justice and fairness and this and that and the other, and we forget that some of these problems are not that difficult, right? I mean, if you look at an organization and you find that in your organization, women have a retention rate that is 20% lower than men, that's costing you a lot of money. And if you were looking at any other part of your business and you found that one function of your business was 20% less profitable than another, you would immediately spend an enormous amount of money. You would hire McKinsey or whoever to figure out what's going on and why you're doing it. And
Yeah.
and some people are doing that, but I kind of think they're doing it kind of in the wrong way. It's about like I've literally had people say to me things like, "Well, you know, isn't it just because women complain more?" I kid you not. I mean, I'm sure you've heard this before, right? I've had somebody that that came up to me and was like, well, wouldn't it be a better investment if we invested in making women and people or people of color a bit more resilient, a bit tougher? And then I tell them some data about some of the things that we measure and some of the experiences that women have in the workplace. And by the way, one thing, this is a little bit of a sidetrack, but when we measure inclusion, we often collect also demographic data because most companies want that, although we don't really need to. We could measure inclusion without looking at diversity, which these days is very handy if you're trying to avoid, the backlash. But one of the things that we found when we've had demographic data is that we typically look at several traits. We look at gender, we look at race and ethnicity, we look at sexual orientation, we look at whether or not people have disabilities, and we look at age. And what we found is that with disability and gender are the only two markers where in every single company we've worked with, there is always a significant gap between being a member of the majority or being anybody else. So if you're a man versus, let's say, woman, gender fluid, gender non-binary, transgender, etc., your experience, your level of inclusion is much higher, or your level of inclusion is much lower. If you have a disability of either a visible or invisible nature, you always have a much worse experience than you do not, than if you don't have a disability. With race and ethnicity, with sexual orientation, it really depends on the environment. And
Yep.
yes, we typically see some patterns, but women, I have to say, especially in technical fields and to some extent in finance, how you do it, I do not know. I mean, the stories that we read of the stuff, and I know because we hear it, my wife is in financial services, and
Yep.
she's fortunate that she works for a fairly progressive company, but still, like the stories that you hear, how women can survive in the workplace is literally beyond me. Because I mean, I think that most men, and certainly myself, if I were put in the position to have to deal with the kind of stuff that you have to deal with, it would be devastating. It would be absolutely devastating. And I'm not just saying that to suck up. I mean, I think this is a true, it's a true thing. And there is an interesting corollary which I've actually written a paper in Forbes, not an academic paper, but using my computer simulation, I was able to show something very interesting, that if you have a company or any organization in which you start out with two groups of people, let's say that the same representation, 50-50, and you create opportunities that make it easier for one group to advance than the other. With successive levels, you're going to see two things. One of them is that the representation of the more advantaged people will increase. So it will go from 50-50 to 60-40 to 70-30, etc. But you will also see that the average talent level of the disadvantaged group goes up. What does that mean? That means that if you're a woman, which intuitively makes sense, but I've proved that kind of mathematically, right? If you're a woman and you make it to VP level in a company, there is a really good probability that you're significantly better than the guy who made it to the same level.
Yep.
Right. And we always hear about the fact, people, and certainly in terms of race, right? People say if you're a black man, you have to work twice as hard to get half as far. If you're a black woman, you have to work three times as hard to get a third as far. And it's actually true. And I can tell you, anytime that I meet a black woman or a black man, but especially black women, because we talk about intersectionality, right? The fact that in a sense, they experience the things that you experience as a woman, and they experience the things that you experience as being a person of color.
Yep.
Anytime that I meet a black woman in a senior position, I know going into the meeting that they are better than me. I know that for a fact. I know that I've made mistakes in my career, that if you made them, or if she made them, or if they made them,
You don't get to come back from
you don't
them.
get
Yeah.
to come back. I've done stuff in my life that honestly, if I was a woman, or if I was particularly a black woman,
Yep.
I would be selling burgers right now. That's the only thing that would be open to me. It's terrible. It's terrible.
It
So,
is.
that's kind of a message that I like to give to people is,
Yeah.
try to appreciate the fact that just because you do not experience adversities in your work, trying to belittle people, or discounting when they tell you that they've had challenges, etc., is, it's very insensitive, and it's very wrong-headed, and it leads you to behaviors that are not very desirable for you or for your company. So those
Yeah.
are important messages that I wish that more people would hear.
Yeah. And kind of going off that, as you look sort of forward, what is kind of your vision for workplace, like the future of the workplace and kind of DEI as a whole as we look forward?
My hope is that people will start to take more seriously the notion that they need to think of their human assets the way that they think about other assets. And by that, by the way, I want to be very careful about something. I have sometimes, especially early on, been criticized about, like, oh, you're just treating people like numbers, and we're humans and it's different. Look, if people were like so truly unique, then statistics would never work, right? I mean, we have certain behaviors and certain commonalities, and we need to learn how to take advantage of those. We need to learn how to use whatever analytical tools we have to actually make the conditions better for everybody, and to allow companies to make more money. So my hope is that, number one, people will get over all of this polarization and this anger, and realize that we all want the same thing. We want to be able to get a job that we are qualified for, regardless of what we look like. And we want to be able to advance in that job and have the opportunity to succeed in that job based on our skills and our contributions, not based on what we look like or how we sound like. And I think that that's what a meritocracy is supposed to be about. But again, if you go around talking about DI, 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 fairness and justice, and then you go talking about meritocracy, 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 and the best candidates only, you're both talking at extreme ends, that are both wrong because they're both not founded on any evidence. It's not evidence based. And so my invitation would be A, let's recognize that we all truly want essentially the same thing. B, that none of us like being discriminated against. And C, that until we become more systematic and quantitative about it, this problem is not going to get solved. And
Yeah.
when you couple that with, I guess, D, which is the dollars, right? When you couple that with the fact that there is a lot at stake and that economically as well as societally, we could see significant improvements, then I have a glimmer of hope that we might get, as this pendulum starts to swing back the other way, that instead of falling back into the old habits, we will use what we've learned to come up with better arguments, with better tools, and with just, better stories to tell that will avoid inflaming people and will actually bring people together and get us all to go toward a shared goal, which I think is a lot more desirable than sitting here arguing about, hypotheticals and extreme cases.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to kind of close it up. And in terms of, and you mentioned the pendulum kind of swinging back. Are you starting to see kind of any trends that are of note across the board as like the where the current environment is right now that you could kind of see both, I would say positive or negative, and then maybe what would cause a shift to kind of sort of come back, I'll call it into equilibrium?
Yeah, I mean, I think what I'm seeing is, usually the pendulum just kind of swings gradually. This time what happened is that after the murder of George Floyd, the pendulum swung reasonably fast, and then it just went whack. It's just like, and now I feel like the pendulum has at least kind of stopped swinging in the sense that I saw in the first 5 months of the year were a disaster for us. I mean, we had, even though a lot of the companies that we work with realize that the work that we do does not cause backlash and it's quantitative, et cetera, we literally lost virtually every client that we're working with on the bigger projects. We're still getting a tremendous amount of demand for training and speaking. And that's because the companies were just freaking out. They were all scrambling. Let's eliminate DI positions. Let's change them to call them something else, etc. That seems to have stabilized somewhat. And what we're also seeing is that there are now so many challenges to some of these, I'm sorry, but I have to say, ridiculous executive orders. I mean, the executive orders are they're a masterclass in how to use rhetoric and propaganda to effectively to elicit fear in people. I mean, there is like so many things in those executive orders that are completely self-contradictory, completely just wrong. And unfortunately, when the president of the United States, issues those, it's very difficult to ignore them. So many legal challenges have come against them that I think what's happening now is I'm seeing a little bit of stabilization. Now, I'm not seeing the pendulum anywhere near starting to swing back, and I think it's going to take some time. My hope is that, and I am hearing a bit of this, that people that have survived the sort of the carnage are realizing we cannot go back to the ways that we were doing things before. And that's my hope. My hope is that people will look at approaches like the one that we take, and I'm not the only one, but there are other people that I think are doing really good quality work that is less controversial, is less irritating, and that we will learn from the mistakes and try to understand, yeah, instead of just blaming white supremacy, let's try to figure out what did we do wrong? Where did we go wrong? How did we get, you can't just blame white supremacy for everything.
Yep.
Yes, they are behind a lot of it, but they took advantage of a very fertile environment that unfortunately we contributed to creating. And if
Yep.
we can understand what mistakes we made and learn from that, I think we will emerge stronger. And look, ultimately, people are the most valuable asset of every company. And that's not just a rhetoric, that's like a true fact. And so all employers, they want to do the right things. They want their employees to be happy. They want to increase retention rates and increase productivity. So my hope is that things will turn around and that we'll be able, is it going to take 2 years? Is it going to take 5 years? I don't know. I
Yep.
can tell you it's going to be a lot slower than the time that it took to kind of devastate or decimate the field of
Yeah.
DI in the last several months.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And I always just think if you come from a place of accountability and curiosity, and then you have the commitment to change things and really collaborate to move the ball forward, nothing is impossible to like go from there. But if you come from a place of avoidance and want the conflict, like we can't do anything with that. And so to kind of round out the conversation and sort of kind of close it out, I'd love to ask some couple questions for you and for listeners to kind of understand a little bit more. I would love to kind of hear from you in terms of your journey thus far. What has been the most surprising insight about inclusion in the workplace for you?
What was interesting for me, the most surprising insight was when I was focusing on building these simulations and trying to understand the impact of diversity. And I had one day I had the chief diversity officer of a very large financial services company that saw the simulation and said, I want to pay you to take that simulation and customize it with my diversity data so I can use it as a strategic planning tool, which was my initial goal with Aleria. And I realized I could not do that. And the reason why I could not do that is because and I've kind of hinted at this before, just knowing the identity of a person is useless. I need to know the fact that you're a woman and you may be a lesbian, you may have a disability, is meaningless unless I know how you're treated in your day-to-day work as a function of that. And
Right.
so that was the most surprising thing was realizing that diversity, that's when I started to realize that we're barking up the wrong tree. And I think that was probably the most surprising thing. And then probably second to that was this realization that inclusion is invisible and how that impacts leaders particularly, and how it makes them the least qualified people to actually try to fix the problems. I mean, both of those were kind of like aha, big eye-opening moments that really changed pretty dramatically my way of thinking and my way of describing the work that I do.
And what would be your one recommendation to any entrepreneur, business owner, CEO that could be listening to this about inclusion and maybe something that they are either actively ignoring or perhaps completely unaware of?
Well, I mean, shamelessly plugging, I would say read my book or watch my
Yep.
TED Talk because I've been working in this space for 10 years.
Yeah.
And I take pride in the fact that one of the skills that I've been very fortunate to have is that the ability to take really complex ideas and turn them into something simple and digestible. That still does not mean that in one 30-second sentence you can do that. There is no silver bullet. But what I can tell
Yep.
people is stop thinking about the old way of DEI, stop thinking about the emotional aspect, etc. Start thinking about what can I do and how can I track what I do or the results of what I do to make sure that I'm making the right decisions, not just for the people in my company, but for my company as a legal financial entity. I think that that's really, again, let's get beyond the rhetoric, let's get beyond the polarization. Don't listen to the stupid arguments or the extreme arguments from either side,
Yep.
and let's try to focus on practical, tangible, measurable things.
And I always like to ask this question because everybody's moment's a little bit different. I would love to know, what was your sort of welcome to entrepreneurship moment?
Actually, my welcome to entrepreneurship was when I told you when I was 17, almost 18, and I took, because I started college early and I was about to start my second year of college, and I took my parents' tuition money. I did tell them I was going to do that, and I bought some tools to start this auto body shop with a friend of mine. That was when I realized, and then of course, it was a disaster. It was like, actually surviving by fixing cars was a bit of a nightmare. And I think that initiated me to, okay, now it was no longer selling pigeon eggs to the nearby farmers or selling trout to the nearby restaurants. It was like we're talking about, that age was real money. It was like a few $1,000s, which to me seemed like a tremendous amount of money. So that was really my first experience. And then when I left academia, before I skipped a little part, but for a few months, actually for about a year, I tried to do my own business, consulting Italian companies. They're hoping that they could get technology companies that could get venture capital in the US. And that was in 2000, just before the internet bubble burst. And that's when I realized, in retrospect, that was like one of the big mistakes. I was so ignorant. I was such hubris, typical white man, right? It's like, oh, I can do this. I'm from Italy. I've done technology. I understand a little bit of how VC works. I had no clue. I kind of embarrassed myself in retrospect. And in the end, when the bubble burst, I realized, okay, this is not the right thing to do. It was a pretty catastrophic failure from my perspective. And it was a really, really good experience. It taught me a little bit of humility, but I was able to bounce back. So,
Always the most important part, right? The fall down 7, get up 8. Yeah.
exactly.
Amazing. And last question is, in your own words, how would you define what built for this means to you?
It's funny. I think that's a wonderful question, and I'm not sure when you use it how you mean it, but to me there was something that resonated with me in that I started doing the DI work in 2000, late 2015. So I just turned 53 years old, right? And I joke with people to say it took me 53 years of my life to figure out what I want to do when I grow up. And the reason for that is that it was the first time in my life that I felt that I was able to bring together everything that I learned. I'd always been very much like, I'll do that because it looks cool. I'll do that
Yeah.
because it seems interesting. What I didn't realize is that I was building a treasure trove of tools, understanding how nonprofits work, understanding how the academic environment works, understanding corporate world, understanding entrepreneurship. I needed all of those to get into this work. And so I would say, to me, built for this is I created a very interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary career that was not really a career, was multiple careers, so that I could eventually get to the point where I could do what I'm doing today. And one of the things that I would tell people is, if you're young, don't ever feel bad about the fact, oh, I'm 21 and I don't know what I want to do in my life. It's like, the people that actually think that they know what they want to do at age of 21 are very, very, very few and far in between. My encouragement is, figure out what you're built for, take the time, develop the skills, expand your horizons, build your network, and then you will be able to know what you're built for.
I love that. Well, I appreciate you coming on today. It was so great to dig in on these topics. You have such amazing insights. And for anybody who's listening, if the means in which you spoke, the style in which you approached this topic, are curious to work with you, what is the best way to connect with you?
I would say my company's website, which is aleria.tech. So that's aleria.tech. Also, if you go to TED.com and you look up my name, Paolo Gaudiano, and I'm sure the spelling will be on your website. I have a TED talk that was actually given as a TEDx, and then the TED organization loved it and put it on their main website. It's a great 13-minute summary of a lot of my core ideas. And then if you look me up on LinkedIn, there is only one Paolo Gaudiano, as far as I know, certainly in DEI. Any of those ways will give you an idea of who I am, what I do, what my background is, and my website and my LinkedIn are the best way to get a hold of me.
Amazing. And I know we are going to do a giveaway of some nature, so I'm going to ask everybody to pay attention to social after, and we'll figure out what that's going to look like to participate. But I appreciate it. And until the next episode, thank you so much.
Thank you, Jen. It's been a real pleasure.